Chapter 7 A Day with the Beavers. While the two boys were whispering behind, both the girls suddenly cried, "Oh!" and stopped. "The robin!" cried Lucy. "The robin! It's flown away!" And so it had, right out of sight. "And now what do we do?" said Edmund, giving Peter a look, which was as much to say, "What did I tell you?" "Shh! Look!" said Susan. "What?" said Peter. "There's something moving among the trees over there, to the left." They all stared as hard as they could, and no one felt very comfortable. "There it goes again," said Susan presently. "I saw it that time too," said Peter. "It's still there. It's just gone behind the big tree." "What is it?" asked Lucy, trying very hard not to sound nervous. "Whatever it is," said Peter, "it's dodging us. It's something that doesn't want to be seen." "Let's go home," said Susan. And then, though nobody thought it out loud, everyone suddenly realized the same fact that Edmund had whispered to Peter at the end of the last chapter. They were lost. "What's it like?" said Lucy. It's a kind of animal," said Susan. And then, look, quick! There it is!" Then they all saw it this time, a whiskered, furry face which had looked out on them from behind a tree. But this time it didn't immediately draw back. Instead, the animal put its paw against its mouth, just as a human would with their fingers against their lips when they were signaling for you to be quiet. Then it disappeared again. The children all stood, holding their breath. A moment later, the stranger came from behind the tree, glanced all around, as if it was afraid someone was watching, and said, "Hush," made a signal for them to join it in a thicker bit of the wood where it was standing, then once more disappeared. "I know what it is," said Peter. "It's a beaver. I saw the tail." "It wants us to go to it," said Susan, "and it is warning us not to make noise." "I know," said Peter. "The question is, are we going to go with it or not?" "What do you think, Lucy?" "I think it's a nice beaver," said Lucy. "Yes, but how do we know?" said Edmund. Shan't we have to risk it?" said Susan. "I mean, it's no good just standing here, and I feel as if I want some dinner." At this moment, the beaver again popped its head out from behind the tree and beckoned earnestly to them. "Come on," said Peter. "Let's give it a try. All keep close together. We ought to have a match for one beaver if it turns out to be an enemy." So the children all got close together and walked up to the tree and in behind it, and there, sure enough, they found a beaver, but it still drew back, saying to them in a hoarse, throaty whisper, "Further in. Come further in, right in here. We are not safe in the open." Only when it had led them to a dark spot where four trees grew so close together that their roots met, and brown earth and pine needles could be seen underfoot because there was no snow had been able to fall there, did it begin to talk to them. "Are you the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve?" it said. We are some of them," said Peter. "Shh," said the beaver. "Not so loud, please. We're not even safe here." "Why, who are you afraid of?" said Peter. "There's no one here but ourselves." "There are trees," said the beaver. "They're always listening. Most of them are on our side, but there are trees who would betray us to her. You know who I mean." And then it nodded its head several times. "If it comes to talking about taking sides," said Edmund, "how do we know you're a friend?" "Not meaning to be rude, Mr. Beaver," added Peter, "but you see, we're strangers." Quite right," said the beaver. "Here is my token." Then with these words, it held out to them a little white object. They all looked at it with surprise until Lucy said, "Oh, of course, it's my handkerchief, the one I gave poor Mr. Tumnus." "That's right," said the beaver. "Poor fellow, he got wind of the arrest before it actually happened and handed this over to me. He said that if anything happened to him, I must meet you here and take you to—" Here the beaver's voice sank into silence, and it gave one or two very mysterious nods, then signaling the children to stand closer around it as they possibly could, so that their faces were actually tickled by its whispered, it added in a low tone, "They say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps he has landed already." And now a very curious thing happened. Not one of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do, but the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it had something happen to you in a dream, and someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels like you had some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one, which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put to words, which means the dream is so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could go back to that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Asin, each one of the children felt something jump inside of them. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize it is the beginning of a holiday or the beginning of the summer. "What about Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. "Where is he?" "Shh, shh," said the Beaver. "Not here. I must bring you where we can have a real talk, and also dinner." No one, except Edmund, felt any difficulty about trusting the Beaver now, and everyone, including Edmund, was very glad to hear the word dinner. Then, therefore, all hurried along behind their new friend, who led them at a surprisingly quick pace, and always in the thickest part of the forest, for over an hour. Everyone was feeling very tired and very hungry, when suddenly the trees began to thin in front of them, and the ground fell into a steep hill. A minute later, they came under the open sky. The sun was still shining, and found themselves looking down on a fine sight. They were standing on the edge of a steep, narrow valley, at the bottom of which ran, at least would have been running if it hadn't been frozen, a fairly large river. Just below them, a dam had been built across the river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly realized that, of course, beavers are always making dams, and felt quite sure that Mr. Beaver had made this one. They also noticed that he had now a sort of modest expression on his face, the sort of look people have when you're visiting their garden they've made or reading a story they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "What a lovely dam!" And Mr. Beaver didn't say hush this time, but merely a trifle, and it isn't really finished. Above the dam there was ought to be a deep pool, but now, of course, was a level floor of thick green ice. And below the dam, much lower down, was more ice, but instead of being smooth, this was all frozen into the foamy and wave shapes in which the water had been rushing along at the very moment when the frost came, and where the water had trickled over and spurted through the dam, there was now glistening walls of icicles, as if the sides of the dam had been covered all over with flowers and wreaths of fistone and pure sugar. And out in the middle, and partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house shaped rather like an enormous beehive, and from the hole in the roof, smoke was going up, so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you at once thought of cooking and became hungrier than you were before. That was what the others chiefly noticed, but Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down the river, there was another small river, which came down another small valley, to join it. And looking up the valley, Edmund saw two small hills, and he was almost sure these were the two hills which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her in the lamp-post the other day. And then, between them, he thought, must be her palace, only a mile off or less. And he thought of the Turkish delight in about being king, and he wondered what will Peter think of that, he asked himself, and horrible ideas came into his head. "Here we are," said Mr. Beaver, "and it looks like as Mrs. Beaver was expecting us. I'll lead the way, but be careful and don't slip." The top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not, for humans, a very nice place to walk, because it was covered in ice, and though the frozen pool was level with one side, there was a nasty drop to the lower river on the other. Along the route, Mr. Beaver led them in single file right out onto the middle, where they could look on the long river and the long way down it. And when they had reached the middle, they were at the door of the house. "Here we are, Mrs. Beaver," said Mr. Beaver. "I found them. Here are the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve." And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed was a burring sound. The first thing she saw was a kind old she-beaver sitting in the corner with thread in her mouth, working busily at her sewing machine. And it was in the form it could, in the sound. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. "So you've come at last," she said, holding out both her wrinkled old paws. "At last! To think that ever should live to see this day. The potatoes are boiling and the kettle singing, and dearest Mr. Beaver, you'll go get some fish." "That I will," said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice of the deep pool, where he had a little hole in the ice, which he kept open every day with his hatchet. Then took a pail with them. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of his hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so chilly. Looked harder into it, then suddenly shot his paw. Before you could say Jack Robinson had whisked out a beautiful trout. Then he did it all over again until he had a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver fill the kettle and lay the table and cut bread and put plates in the oven to heat and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from the barrel which stood in one corner of the house, and to putting on the fry pans and getting the dripping hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's caves. There was no books or pictures, and instead of beds, there were a bunk, like on board a ship, built into the walls, and there was ham and strings of onion hanging from the roof, and against the walls there were gumboats and oilskins and hatchets, and pairs of shears and blades and trowels and things to carry mortar and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks. And the cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in the open air. You can think how good a new caught fish smelled while they were frying, and how the hungry children longed for them to be done, and how very much hungrier still they had become before Mrs. Beaver said, "Now we are nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and put them all back into the empty pot to dry on the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout, so that in a few minutes everyone was drawing up the stools, which were all three-legged stools in the Beavers' house, except for Mrs. Beaver, whose own special rocking chair stood beside the fire. In preparing to enjoy themselves, there was a jug of creamy milk for the children. Mr. Beaver stuck to beer, and a great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, to which everyone took much as he wanted to go with his potatoes, and all the children, and agreed with them, that there is nothing to beat good fresh fish if you eat it while it had been alive an hour ago and has come off the pan half an hour ago. And then, when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out an oven a great and a glorious sticky marmalade roll, steamingly, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire, that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured out. And when each person had gotten his or her cups of tea, each person shoved back his or her stool so that they would be able to lean against the wall and give a long sigh of contentment. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling his cup of tea towards him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit and going nicely, why, now we can get to business. It's snowing again," he added, cocking his eye at the window. That's all the better, because it means we shan't be followed by visitors, and if anyone shall have been trying to follow you, why, he wouldn't be able to find your tracks."